Hi devs. In this video, I'm going to review code for readability. This code is taken from an actual readability review. I modified the language and I put it into TypeScript because that's my favorite language. And I changed some of the names and comments and things to protect the innocent. So here's some code. Pause and look at this code and think to yourself, what would you do to improve its readability? All right, the first step in reviewing a function is to ask yourself, can I figure out what this function does without reading its code? The next thing I want to ask is, can I figure out how to use this function without reading its code? Can I figure out how to pass parameters? Can I figure out what it returns and how it behaves? So let's look at those things. Well, let's see. Up here is a comment about what it does. It seems to be pretty descriptive. It tells me what parameter I'm supposed to pass in, and it tells me what it returns. So that's the first thing. But now, let's ask the second one. Can I actually use this function without making any mistakes? Well, first of all, I'm going to call this with an actor ID. But that actor ID requires a prefix. It says it has to be user here, user colon, or group colon. What are the chances that I will remember to do that? Will I be making mistakes? Also, it says that it returns an empty string if the actor is not found. Well, what about the return value? The return value is an empty is a token or an empty string if the actor is not found. That means that I'm going to have to examine that return value to look for an empty string. Will I remember to do that? So it sounds pretty easy in this case to mix up my actors, my tokens, my errors. I'm probably going to get confused as I'm trying to call and use this function. One other thing that is interesting to me is the method name. It's called getAuthToken, but yet it makes a network request. In many languages, the get indicates to the caller that this is a very quick and brief function that doesn't do very much. But in this case, it's going to be long running. So maybe the name isn't quite as good as it ought to be. So what do we do to improve this? Well, first of all, this string here and this string here, we're passing these strings around. This is often called the code smell of primitive obsession. And so we want to try and address that. One of the first things we can do is we can introduce a different object type that represents the actor ID and another object type that represents the return value, the token. So I can do those. I probably want to have two different actor ID types, one for a user and one for a group, so that I don't have to remember what is what. And I will want those objects to actually insert the prefix in the right place for me. Let's talk about the return value. So the return value, again, it returns a promise of a string, and I really don't like to have having to think, well, I need to check for an empty string. Why doesn't it just throw an exception? Exceptions are great, and the exceptions are your friends, so you should use them. If we don't find the actor ID, we really should just throw an exception. And then finally, what about that name? Let's change from something a little bit more descriptive about what this does, something that indicates that it is doing some network activity and may take a little while. And so instead of getAuthToken, we can try lookupAuthToken or something like that. So those are the changes that I would request and mention in a review to the author of this code. How would it look when we're done? Take a moment for you to think about how you would change this code, and then take a look at the code that I think it should look like and what it actually looked like after the review was done. So you're back. Here's the code that I think would be a great way to actually write this function. So the comment is pretty much the same as it was before, the description of the function. The params and returns are fine, but I added this throws clause. It tells us what happens what happens if the actor can't be found, that it will throw an exception. So I now know that I have to catch that exception. I changed the name to be lookup auth token, and I introduced these two types, a user ID and a group ID. And these types will encode the necessary prefix in them, so that my code doesn't, so that the caller doesn't have to be to do that. And then finally, I introduced this auth token, and I'm returning the auth token type. The rest of it, the innards of the function are pretty similar, and so that's it. That's how I would improve this code.